By the 1980s, Latino-led drug organizations emerged to dominate street-level distribution in New York City. Among them were two brothers who built one of the most sophisticated and profitable heroin operations that the city has ever seen. The Torres Brothers' story is one of stark extremes: meteoric wealth followed by devastating punishment and ultimately profound redemption. George Torres was the eighth of 10 children born on July 23, 1957 to Urbano Torres and Luisa Lebron in Guayama, Puerto Rico. His family moved to New York City when he was a baby, and he grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He attended Seward Park High School but returned to Puerto Rico and graduated from Miguel Melendez High School in Bayamon in 1976. After graduation, he entered the Navy and was honorably discharged in 1980. His younger brother Victor was born on October 25, 1961 and was the youngest child. He attended Morris High School in the South Bronx, then transferred to school in Puerto Rico where he graduated in 1981. By 1982, both Victor and George were back in New York City, and Victor was working as a handyman in Manhattan. But it would just be a matter of time before the paths of the Torres brothers' lives would change drastically. While both brothers were regarded as respectable young men with solid reputations, somewhere along the line they got drawn into the heroin trade here on the Lower East Side. Their older brother, Urbano Torres, was involved with drug dealing in New York and Puerto Rico. At the time, most of the heroin entering New York came from Sicily. It began with opium from Afghanistan, which was processed into morphine, then sent to Sicily, where it was refined into heroin in underground labs. It was then packed into compromised food containers, then shipped in cargo, or couriers would carry suitcases of heroin on Alitalia Airlines with inside help. In New York, they used pizza parlors as drug fronts, where they received shipments and distributed the product. This drug ring was known as the Pizza Connection and was responsible for 80% of the heroin coming into New York at that time. The close proximity of the heavily Puerto Rican Lower East Side to the mafia-controlled Little Italy led to a long history of heroin partnerships between Puerto Rican crews and Italian organized crime. By 1983, Victor and George were operating a heroin ring on the Lower East Side, which was quickly growing. Soon they moved most of their heroin operation to here in the South Bronx and its adjacent neighborhoods, which was one of the busiest heroin markets in the entire country, and thus a lucrative location for dope dealers to be. The Torreses received kilos of heroin from their suppliers and had it processed in apartments called cutting mills. There, what's known as the table crew would cut down the bulk heroin, dilute it, then package it into waxy bags called glassines, which were then stamped with brand logos. They sold a brand called Checkmate, which had a logo of a king being checkmated by two castles stamped on every glassine. Heroin brands are referred to in the streets as stamps, due to each product having a specific logo stamped on the glassines, and they also sold different stamps to other dealers. They set up various sales locations across the Bronx and employed street managers to oversee the workers below them. Every day, street managers were delivered bundles of heroin to disperse to the dealers, who then sold to customers. Throughout 1983, business was lucrative for the brothers, with sales around $20,000 a day, and by the end of the year, they had pulled in millions in revenue. Then in April of 1984, the heroin business was dealt a major blow when the Pizza Connection was busted. 38 people were indicted in the United States and Sicily, labs were shut down, and the heroin market was in turmoil for the time being. This was when the Chinese stepped in to fill the void. They began importing heroin from the Golden Triangle, a region in Southeast Asia where opium was cultivated, then refined into heroin in jungle laboratories. From there, it was smuggled into the US via maritime shipments and couriers on commercial flights. Chinese social associations in Chinatown, known as Tongs, began to take over heroin trafficking in New York and used gangs such as the Flying Dragons to facilitate street distribution. The heroin from the Golden Triangle, which was known for its high purity and referred to as China White, was now the most prevalent smack in the streets of New York City and its surrounding areas. The brothers applied the logic of business marketing to an illegal enterprise, understanding that customer loyalty was vital no matter the trade. The Torres Organization's flagship brand was Checkmate, which was high-quality, 40% pure Southeast Asian heroin and sold in $10 bags. Dozens of dealers paid the Torreses for the right to sell Checkmate, and the brothers also franchised numerous other heroin brands to dealers across the region. They didn't drink, smoke, or do drugs, and by now they were both married and the fathers of children. In business, they were ambitious, disciplined, and goal-oriented. They had learned that strong branding was essential, and the product had to be clearly and consistently branded to earn recognition and trust from customers. Checkmate had become synonymous with quality heroin. It was one of the most popular on the market and could be found sold all over the Northeast. By 1985, the brothers controlled numerous sales locations across the Bronx, including on East 137th Street in Mott Haven, Watson Avenue in Soundview, East 166th Street and Washington Avenue in Morrisania, and their main location, which was on University Avenue in the West Bronx. The Torreses ran their drug operation like a corporation with a structured hierarchy and numerous employees. At the top were Jorge and Victor acting as co-executives, and beneath them were managers, street dealers, couriers, mill workers, as well as enforcers to keep things in line. Nelson Flores joined the operation in late 1985, and he became their top lieutenant and chief operating officer. He coordinated the wholesale purchase of heroin, managed mill workers, delivered heroin to street managers, and maintained the books for the operation. He kept track of all finances, including losses arising from bail for arrests, near arrests when stashes were discarded during police pursuits, and robberies. He rented a unit used as a cutting mill in apartment 409 at 2700 Grand Concourse in Kingsbridge, which was a central storage and meeting location for the Torres Organization. Other key players included Jesus Santiago and Manuel Vasquez, who were Nelson Flores' top lieutenants and assisted him in a wide range of tasks. Santiago charged the street tax to other dealers selling on East 137th Street, and also oversaw a crew of enforcers to handle matters as needed. Natalie Vasquez assisted in the sale of large amounts of heroin and operated a drug house where she safeguarded vast quantities of cash, heroin, bulletproof vests, guns, drug records, and packaging equipment. Fernando Padron and Reginald Velez were street managers who handled delivery logistics for sales locations and coordinated pickups for distribution. Dennis Rivera was a connection to wholesale heroin and was involved in the day-to-day deliveries and storage. Raymond Coffey owned a small construction business in the Bronx and handled a variety of important services for the crew, including supplying them with income statements, paychecks, and tax records to justify employment and account for their illegal income. Pedro Cruz and Carlos Nunez were runners who transported heroin and sales proceeds. Luis Rivera owned a co-op apartment which was used as a cutting mill and assisted in the day-to-day duties. Efren Arcelay ran errands for the Torres Brothers and Nelson Flores and allowed his name to be used for the purchase of cars and the rental of safety deposit boxes. Throughout 1985, the Torres Organization was pulling in well over $200,000 a week in revenue. They now had a distribution network stretching across the city, and along with the Bronx and LES, they had also expanded to Queens. Jorge and Victor were methodical and cautious, always trying to stay one step ahead of authorities, and frequently changed apartments to avoid detection. They viewed themselves as entrepreneurs, not street thugs, and treated violence as a liability to be avoided. However, as is customary in their business, they maintained an arsenal of weapons, and many crew members armed themselves as a precaution against rival threats. To legitimize their profits, they formed Torres Brothers Inc., a real estate investment company which used the Checkmate logo as their corporate emblem. They began to purchase properties in cash through intermediaries in New York and Puerto Rico, and were determined to build an enterprise of real estate and businesses. They also had numerous joint ventures with Raymond Coffee, including purchasing abandoned buildings and renovating them. Around this time, they hired an 18-year-old named George Rivera to work for them. George first began as a lookout on Watson Avenue, but was quickly promoted to dealer. He displayed the type of ambition that the Torreses appreciated, and soon he was promoted to manage their location at 166 and Washington Avenue. Nicknamed Boy George due to his advanced street smarts at such a young age, he hired numerous workers and was a disciplined and dedicated spot manager. He woke up early every day to make sure things were in order and the spot was running smoothly. His sales were upwards of $65,000 a week, and after paying back the Torres Brothers, he paid his employees from his cut and the rest was his. In the summer of 1986, Victor and George constructed a two-story complex that resembled a castle on Comerio Norte Avenue in Levittown, Puerto Rico. It included an 11-shop mall, a bowling alley, and pizza restaurant. They named it Tower Lanes Plaza as a reference to their own last names, as Torres translates to towers in English. In the front of the mall was the same king and castles logo that appeared on the Checkmate glass scenes. By now, the Torreses had shifted their base to Puerto Rico and ran things remotely through Nelson Flores, who now oversaw every aspect of the operation. They were now utilizing at least 14 different apartments throughout the Bronx as cutting mills, stash houses, and distribution points. Throughout 1986, the Torres Organization was a powerhouse and the biggest heroin ring in the South Bronx. They had also added other heroin brands to their sales catalog named 357 and Blue Moon. Revenue continued increasing, and by the end of the year, they had brought in excess of $10 million, which is over $30 million in today's money. With the brothers making staggering profits came lavish purchases such as expensive jewelry, opulent homes, and luxury cars including Porsches, Mercedes-Benzes, BMWs, and a $160,000 Lamborghini. From the very start of 1987, money continued pouring in. In January, they amassed $1 million from a single deal. They continued transforming their drug profits into tangible assets. Besides the shopping center, they now own 3 gas stations, 7 homes, one of which was purchased for their parents, a yacht, 4 parcels of land, and 4 commercial fishing vessels, which were also used to transport heroin. In just their 20s, Victor and George had an empire worth an estimated $25 million, which was considered one of the largest drug-related fortunes in the Northeast at that time. One way they attempted to legitimize some of their illegal income was by purchasing the winning lottery tickets off of the actual winners of the Puerto Rican lottery. They paid them for their winnings plus an added premium, then cashed the tickets as the purported winners. The winners were happy to take the deal because not only did they receive more money than they actually won, they could avoid paying significant federal income taxes on the winnings. By now, the organization has shifted to selling new heroin brands named Monopoly and Top Secret, deliberately distancing themselves from the Checkmate name, which had become well known to law enforcement. For the next few months, sales averaged $40,000 a day, but reached as high as $90,000 in a single 24-hour period. Their monthly revenue average for the first quarter of the year was $1.2 million a month. But no matter how structured and efficient the Torres enterprise was, it would soon be undone by its own scale. They had drawn the attention of the DEA, IRS, and New York Attorney's Office. By early 1987, federal agents had infiltrated parts of the Checkmate operation, tracing its financial networks and surveilling drug mills in the Bronx. On May 27, 1987, the DEA had secured authorization to wiretap Nelson Flores' phone. For the next 28 days, agents recorded more than 2,400 calls, capturing discussions in coded language, speaking about pay reports and transactions that unveiled the organization's full scope.
These phone calls provided all the damning evidence that authorities needed, and they were ready to make their move.
On June 24, 1987, a major multi-agency operation involving 300 federal agents and police officers struck simultaneously in New York and Puerto Rico. Victor and George were arrested in Puerto Rico, and $500,000 in cash and bank checks were confiscated from them. At the same time, agents in New York swept 21 apartments across the Bronx. 40 people were arrested, including Nelson Flores and his mother, Rosa. While searching the apartment operated by Natalie Vasquez, agents uncovered an enormous cache of incriminating evidence, including a loaded .357 Magnum, 2 bundles of heroin, bulletproof vests, over $200,000 in cash, over $100,000 in jewelry, a $10,000 gold bullion, drug records, and several ledgers with addresses and phone numbers. The meticulous record-keeping that once symbolized control and efficiency now became the evidence that would be used against them. Over $2 million worth of heroin and 21 guns were recovered from various different apartments. The collapse of the Torres Organization created an immediate power vacuum, and Boy George wasted no time filling it. Within a day of the takedown, he shelved Checkmate and rolled out a new brand called Obsession. Backed by a hungry squad of hustlers known as the Obsession Crew, he now owned 166 in Washington and opened a number of more spots. He applied what he absorbed from working under Victor and George to his own operation, and before long he was running the largest heroin ring in the South Bronx.
In January of 1988, the Torreses and their associates were named in a 32-count federal indictment, with charges including running a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute heroin, tax evasion, firearms violations, and money laundering. Unlike most drug organizations of their size, there were no charges of violence or murders in the indictment. Numerous defendants copped out to varying charges, but Victor, George, and 11 other people chose to stand trial. The brothers' trial began in April of 1988 in the Southern District of New York, with Judge John M. Walker presiding. Prosecutors painted the brothers as disciplined crime bosses who had built their own version of the Medellin cartel business model on American soil. They unveiled business ledgers, tape recordings, and numerous pictures, including the mall's Checkmate logo, which directly tied the brothers' business holdings to the heroin stamps. Among their lawyers' defense tactics was to attack the government's methods, but the evidence was overwhelming.
On July 6, 1988, the jury delivered its verdict. Both George and Victor Torres were convicted on nearly all counts, including operating a continuing criminal enterprise and drug trafficking. They were also fined $12 million each. Nelson Flores was convicted of 12 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy, and intent to distribute heroin. Jesus Santiago, Natalie Vasquez, Dennis Rivera, and Reginald Velez were all convicted of several counts each, including drug conspiracy charges. Raymond Coffey was convicted of 1 conspiracy count. Pedro Cruz was convicted of conspiracy and intent to distribute heroin. Fernando Padron was convicted of 1 count of conspiracy. 12 of the 13 defendants who stood trial were convicted. The only one to be acquitted was Nelson Flores' mother, Rosa.
The brothers and Nelson Torres faced the stiffest penalties under the so-called super-kingpin provision, an enhanced penalty implemented in 1984 as an aggressive measure for federal prosecutors to go after narcotics empires. It targeted major drug lords who led vast operations, mandating life imprisonment without parole for any leaders grossing more than $10 million.
A subsequent jury verdict ordered the forfeiture of between $20 and $30 million of assets. This included the shopping center in Levittown, their gas stations, all of their properties, including their parents' house, over $1 million in cash and jewelry from their homes and safe deposit boxes, and all of their automobiles. It was one of the largest narcotics-related forfeitures in U.S. history. Judge John Walker ordered 40% of the seized assets to be funneled back into the South Bronx to finance drug prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation programs. At their sentencing on September 14, 1988, Judge John Walker sentenced 26-year-old Victor Torres and 31-year-old George Torres to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Their second-in-command, Nelson Flores, was also sentenced to life in prison without parole. Jesus Santiago received 40 years in prison. Natalie Vasquez, Dennis Rivera, Reginald Velez, and Fernando Padron each received 27 years. Pedro Cruz was sentenced to 25 years. Raymond Coffey received 10 years, and Luis Rivera received 5.
Victor and George, along with their defense team, family, and supporters, were stunned and outraged at the severity of the sentence. Without any convictions for violent crimes, the brothers were effectively handed a punishment which condemned them to die in prison. The brothers both began serving their terms at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, and each had left behind 3 small children at the time their sentences began. On appeal, one of their arguments was that their sentences were unjust because they were first-time offenders, but the court rejected that claim, ruling that they repeatedly offended every day that they took part in narcotics trafficking for 4 years. The brothers had filed motions to vacate the forfeiture orders, but they were all denied, and by 1995, the government had seized all of their properties and assets.
Behind bars, the brothers underwent profound personal transformations, confronting the consequences of their past and committing to reshaping their lives and the lives of others. They focused on education, and Victor graduated magna cum laude from Park College in Missouri with a bachelor's degree in science, and both he and George trained as dental lab technicians. The brothers also both became Christian pastors. In 2000, they were transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Fairton, New Jersey. Victor worked as a suicide companion for over a decade, and he and George spoke to troubled youth, speaking candidly about the false allure of the criminal life and the harsh, unforgiving reality of prison.
I became kingpin. This is my kingdom. This is my living room. This is where I meet my guests. This is where I meet my family. This is the place I met my youngest daughter. She was born while being incarcerated. This is the place where I met her. And if you continue walking in the same footsteps that I did and that these men did, you're going to wind up in the same circumstances. I ran the streets. I tell a person, listen, do this, and he did it. In here, everybody tells me what to do. Tell me when to get up. Tell me when to go to sleep. Tell me who I can visit, who I can't visit, who I can call, who I can't call. Every aspect of my life is being dictated by somebody else. Because I didn't know how to control my life when I was out there.
Their family were staunch supporters of theirs and paid them frequent visits over the years. The brothers both took part in numerous apprenticeships and obtained certifications from various different programs. They became mentors to younger inmates and were active members of the prison chapel at Fairton.
During their incarcerations, the brothers filed numerous appeals and petitions, seeking sentence reductions and challenging their convictions, but they were all denied. By 2019, all of their co-defendants had been released, and they were the only ones from their case who remained in prison.
In 2018, a major federal justice reform law called the First Step Act was passed. It focused on rehabilitation, sentencing reform, reducing recidivism rates, and expanding early release options. The Torreses were represented by attorneys Ariana Goodman and Catherine Devlin in a partnership with Brittany Barnett of the Buried Alive Project, who consistently worked on their behalf to obtain sentence commutations. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, inmates faced an elevated risk of infection, and courts began reviewing cases of individuals eligible for possible early release. The Torres' attorneys filed motions for sentence reductions under the First Step Act's compassionate release provision. The judge who had originally sentenced Victor and George to life in prison without parole, John Walker, wrote a letter to Manhattan federal judge Sidney Stein, who was working their appeal. Walker wrote, "In more than 32 years on the bench, this is the first time that I have supported a commutation. But it is the first time that I have encountered convicted individuals whom I have sentenced that have rehabilitated themselves so completely and have rejected their criminal past so resoundingly." By 2020, 59-year-old Victor and 63-year-old George had both been incarcerated for 33 years, which was more than half of their lives. Persuaded by Judge Walker's letter, Sidney Stein stated, "Both have maintained an exemplary record while in prison. Despite their life without parole sentences, the Torres brothers have, by all accounts, made the most of the last 3 decades." Judge Stein granted their motion and commuted their life sentences to time served and ordered them to be released. On June 1st, 2020, Victor and George Torres walked out of prison free men. After their release, in a joint statement, the brothers said that they plan to travel the U.S., sharing their stories of hope and rehabilitation to at-risk youth. Since leaving prison, both men have been spending time with family and continue involvement in the ministry.
The Torres Organization was built on branding, order, and structure, proof that the drug trade at its highest levels often mirrors legitimate enterprise. Victor and George Torres earned astounding riches and built a tremendous portfolio from drug profits, but no amount of planning could save them from the eyes of law enforcement once their empire reached a scale too large to ignore. After their reigns as drug bosses ended, what remained were life sentences, forfeited fortunes, and decades spent living with the reality of their choices. But rather than fade into obscurity like many prisoners before them, they transformed behind penitentiary walls by educating themselves, mentoring others, and openly rejecting the life that once defined them. The Torres brothers' story endures not as a tale of glamour, but as a reminder that ambition on the wrong side of the law can generate power and build riches, but will cost everything in return.